I'm going to talk about how the mind affects the world. So it's basic mind-body issues, and I'll explore some of the basic points and then say a bit about how recent philosophy has thought about this issue, how this generates a problem, and how I think that problem should be solved. So here's the plan. I've got four sections: the rise of materialism, the return of epiphenomenalism, emergent causation, and then mental autonomy restored. That's fine. So, first section. So, let's start with a very standard, familiar kind of puzzle. How does the mind, focus on the conscious mind perhaps, how does the conscious mind, feelings and decisions and so on, affect the physical world? In particular, how does it affect our brains and our bodies, in particular when it causes us to behave in certain ways? Very natural thought that what's going on in our mind influences how our bodies behave. But how is this causal relationship between the mind and the body to be understood? Now, I guess the first thought that most people would have is a kind of interactive dualism. There's the physical realm, atoms and molecules, and our body's made of that, and our brain's made of that. And then in addition, there's an extra realm, the realm of consciousness. The mind is extra to, separate from the brain, but nevertheless it has power when we reflect and make decisions to come down and somehow influence the physical world and guide our behavior. That's the view that Descartes had. Descartes was very much a dualist, two separate realms, matter and extension, mind outside space though not time, and the mind's deliberations would then influence the physical world through, Descartes thought, the pineal gland. That's the point at which he thought the mind influenced the physical world. That sounds a bit silly, but as I'll explain in a little while, variants of interactionist dualism were very much the orthodox view, not specifically in Descartes' mould, until relatively recently, 100, 150 years ago. But even so, interactive dualism is no longer at all popular, not among philosophers, and to a large extent, I think, not outside philosophy either. And it's an interesting question, why not? And I think the basic reason that interactive dualism is no longer really a player in this debate is that it's very difficult to avoid the thought that all the laws governing what goes on in the brain and consequently in our bodies just depend on physical processes, the interaction of physical properties and quantities. It's very natural to suppose that if we were studying the brain and its interaction with the rest of the body, we wouldn't really need to bring in anything beyond gravitational forces, electromagnetic forces, nuclear forces. We wouldn't need to bring in order to understand what's going on in the brain, anything that we don't expect to find outside the body as well. When I say physical, just think of things that you expect to find outside living bodies. And it's a very common thought nowadays that you aren't going to find any extra physical quantities or processes or forces or anything like that operating inside bodies that you don't also find outside. So, if you're a dualist and you think the conscious mind is somehow extra to physical goings-on, well then it looks like you're in danger of becoming an epiphenomenalist. So the epiphenomenalist view is the view that the mind doesn't actually make any difference, doesn't have any causal effects in the physical world, because the operation of physical processes doesn't leave any room for the mind to get into the story. There's no gaps there. Everything that happens in the body and the brain is governed by familiar physical laws, and there's no space left for the mind to make any difference. And that line of thinking pushes you towards epiphenomenalism. So epiphenomenalism is a view that there is a separate conscious mind, but it's a kind of causal dangler. It's kind of feelings are produced by the brain when the brain is doing its thing, it's going through its operations, but these feelings don't make any difference to what happens in the brain. The operation of the brain is always caused by the brain states and so on, and as a kind of puffs of smoke given off by the steam train, there are these extra feelings, but they don't make any more difference to operations of the brain than puffs of smoke make to the operation of the train. That's the epiphenomenalist view. It's rather like, look, you might think that your conscious feelings and mental processes make a difference to the physical world, in particular to what you do, but that's an illusion. It's like the little child who's sitting next to her parent with a little toy steering wheel, and they think that they're driving the car, but in fact they're making no difference at all. It's all due to what the real steering wheel is doing. Now that's a rather unattractive view, I take it. In fact, it's a lot worse than unattractive. It becomes pretty incoherent pretty quickly. But it's unattractive because surely we do want to think that our mental deliberations, our feelings and so on are responsible for how we behave. And so epiphenomenalism would rule that out. And worse than that, I mean, epiphenomenalism, so you think that when you say, I'm now having a pain or I'm having some exciting red experience, you're speaking in a way that's influenced by the conscious pain and the exciting red experience. But if epiphenomenalism were true, that's not so. I mean, there's the pain up there, but the movement of your lips is being influenced by brain processes which I think owe nothing to the pain at all. So, epiphenomenalism is something, I take it, to be avoided. And the way to avoid it is to conclude that the mind isn't a separate realm from the brain in the first place. You have to accept that mental events just are complexes of brain events. That's a materialist view. It's not that mental goings, I mean, materialist doesn't deny that there are mental events, that there are decisions and conscious feelings and so on. It's just they say they aren't something extra over and above the material goings on. They're just part of the material world. When you have certain kinds of complex neural events, then for the beings who are in those complex neural events, so to speak, it's like something. These complex neural events are decisions, feelings, pains and so on. And that's the orthodox view among philosophers today. I can actually tell you exactly how orthodox it is because David Chalmers and associate David Bourget 2 or 3 years ago did a survey of 3,000 English-speaking philosophers and asked their views on various matters. Are you moral objectivists? Do you believe in numbers? And what do you think about the mind-brain issue? Are you materialists or dualists or what? And it's 58% materialists and about 20% dualists and about 20% agnostics. And the reason philosophers are all materialists, well, all is exaggeration, I mean, are majority materialists, is because this seems the only good way of explaining, given that everything going on in the brain seems to be governed by physical laws, how the mind can make a difference to the movements of our bodies and so on. The problem of how the mind makes a difference goes away once you identify the mental processes with certain neural arrangements. It's no more a puzzle. So somebody might be puzzled, how can political parties ever make a difference to what happens in society, given that it's always numbers of people who produce any social effects? And the answer to that is not to say, well, so political parties are just epiphenomenal. The answer to say is, look, political parties just are numbers of people. And that's how they manage to have effects. The idea is that when we talk about political parties and we talk about numbers of people, we're just talking about the same thing in different terms. And that's the materialist view. When we talk about conscious decisions or feelings or so on, we're just talking about arrangements of neurons, neural processes in different terms. It's an interesting question, given that there's such a widespread acceptance of materialism among contemporary thinkers. Why hasn't it always been so? I think if you took the same survey of philosophers, well, I can remember just about, I'm that old, but if you took it 80 years ago, the numbers would have been reversed. I think if you took it 150 years ago, you would have got single figure materialists, if that. So it's an interesting question. If this is such a compelling line of reasoning, why is it only recently that it's come to hold so much sway? And you might feel, well, perhaps it's not such a compelling line of reasoning. Perhaps materialism, the modern enthusiasm, is just fashion. But I think there's a good answer to the question of why materialism has so much come into vogue in the last 100 years or so. And that's that the premise that I used in the line of argument, trying to show you how materialism was the only option, that premise is itself a relatively recent discovery. So I said the premise was that all laws governing brain and bodily processes involve only physical properties and quantities in the sense of things that you expect to find outside bodies as well. And that's an assumption which I take it when I put to you, also, yes, that's right there. There's only the four fundamental forces and combinations, and that's all there is in nature. But 150 years ago, that wouldn't have struck people as obvious at all. Even the most informed scientists who were persuaded of the conservation of energy, we might talk about that later because that has kind of implications for the mind as well, in the late 19th century would have taken it to be pretty obvious that among the forces that there are that respect the conservation of energy are sui generis fundamental chemical forces and sui generis fundamental vital forces to account for the distinctive way in which bodies operate, and sui generis fundamental mental forces. So it's a lovely relic of this, the phrase nervous energy. So we all know what somebody's nervous energy, they're kind of antsy, they're twitchy, they're full of nervous energy. We say that all the time. But 150 years ago, people meant it absolutely literally. They thought there was a nervous force field, and what happened as you deliberated and readied yourself for action is you built up the potential energy of the nervous force field, and when the moment for action came, that potential energy was, so to speak, released into the kinetic energy of your bodily movements. And so you talk about somebody being full of nervous, they're all ready to go. I mean, they're all kind of like a elastic band, all stretched, ready to go. And that's a phrase that points back to a relatively recent time when people didn't have this argument for being materialists. They thought, in addition to the kinds of processes you find outside bodies, chemistry, electricity, magnetism, gravitation, there was an extra thing, a realm of mental field, a mental field that in the right circumstances would impose forces on bits of matter and move them around. So they were kind of interactionist dualists, not in the Cartesian mold where Descartes had a different physics, but as it were Newtonian interactionist dualists. And the reason there aren't many of them around anymore is that, well, I think there's lots of evidence, not of a kind of direct and conclusive kind, but lots of evidence that there aren't any special forces outside, operating inside bodies that don't operate outside. I think a crucial development in this respect was, through the 20th century, lots of work on intracellular processes, culminating with Huxley and Hodgkin working out the operations of nerve cells in the 1950s, and showing that they didn't involve anything more than familiar electrical chemical processes. And at that point it's very striking. You find half a dozen prominent philosophers constructing arguments in favor of materialism on the basis that there isn't any room for the mind to affect your bodies unless materialism were true. Okay. Let's say a little bit about Liebert. So, I guess most people here know about Liebert's experiments, but maybe there's one or two who don't. I'll just run through them quickly, because there's a series of experiments the last 30 years or so by German physiologists that might make you think, hang on, haven't we now got scientific evidence that the conscious mind is epiphenomenal? So my idea that we have to be materialists to avoid epiphenomenalism, you might think, no, that doesn't quite work. We've got direct evidence that epiphenomenalism is true, and so perhaps we should be non-materialist epiphenomenalists. There is this extra conscious realm, but it doesn't actually make any difference to our bodily behavior. So just in case there's a few of you worrying about that, let me just say what I think about that. So the experiments are like this. You get somebody in the lab and you say, here's a button, I want you to push it sometime in the next 3 minutes. And then there's a big clock on the wall, big stopwatch, going around like this once a second, but big enough that subjects can kind of judge milliseconds, and you ask the subjects to judge when did they consciously decide to press the button. And Liebert also has them wired up with electrodes so he can see when their motor cortex starts sending messages or kind of gets geared up. This is the time to do the pressing. And the very striking thing is that the conscious, I'm going to press now, the conscious event happens about half a second or so after the motor cortex is starting to do its thing. So in this case it looks like it's not the conscious decision that got you to press your finger. Your brain got you to press your finger, and the conscious decision is just a kind of side effect, maybe some way that you can keep track of what happened, but not the thing that made you press your finger then. And that does make it look like the conscious goings-on are epiphenomenal to the actual causation of the behavior. I don't think that really establishes epiphenomenalism generally. It's a rather funny setup. I don't think that deciding to press your finger some moment, or pressing your finger some moment over the next 2 minutes, is the paradigm of the kind of situation where your conscious mind affects your behavior. In fact, it's almost a paradigm of a situation where it doesn't. What happens? You just press it. And there's no real deliberation or decision or feeling that makes you press it. So compare the paradigm of a case where our conscious decisions make a difference to what we do. We deliberate for a while. I was invited to China next month. But I'm really busy, and I'm about to go off to America to work there, and I thought, no, I can't do it. And I emailed the guy, and I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, whatever Liebert shows, it seems to me it doesn't follow from that all my deliberations over the weekend weren't the cause of my typing the email that I sent the guy to say I can't do it. So if you think about cases where there's real conscious deliberation and then making a decision, it's perfectly natural to suppose that in those cases what you're doing affects your later behavior. Even in the Liebert case, there's no conscious causation of what happens there. So I don't think the Liebert stuff is any good argument for embracing epiphenomenalism. Okay, but epiphenomenalism is not going to disappear from the story. There's a way in which it's going to bounce back and bite us. So now I'm going to kind of describe how this issue of the mental affecting the physical world has played out in recent English-speaking philosophy, kind of after we all became materialists 50 years ago. So here's a first development. People got a bit uneasy about the kind of crude reductionism that you might think materialism invites. A kind of unthinking materialism that, as I put it, feelings, decisions, conscious experiences just are arrangements of neurons. And they started saying, look, that's not really doing justice to the way that we think and talk and understand mental events. You might think them in a way that just talking about what individual people are doing isn't really doing justice to the complexity and patterns that you get with political parties. There's a level of description which is independent of what's going on at the level of individual people. And so many philosophers of mind started to think was the case with the mind and the brain. They started to think, look, well, even if we're materialists and there's nothing more going on than neural processes, we don't want to identify any type of mental state with any specific neural properties. So imagine an example I'm going to use. That I form a desire to hail a taxi, to stop a taxi. And so I'm going to wave my arm. Do I really want? So that's a kind of mental property, wanting to stop a taxi. Do I really want to say that everybody who wants to stop a taxi must have some neural property in common? Couldn't you? Some of us have bigger neurons, more neurons. I mean, wouldn't we expect that the neurons would be differently arranged in different people? Some people are colorblind, some people have experiences of different kind of taxis, different associations. Why would we want to suppose that there's some specifiable neural property that's common to all the people who want to hail a taxi? Perhaps we should think of describing people as having a certain desire wanting to hail a taxi as a level of description which is fairly independent and autonomous from the descriptions that you're going to give at the neural level. Maybe what we should say is that wanting to hail a taxi is a matter of having some neural arrangements, we're not going to be very specific about which, that kind of fit into a certain structure. They kind of get you to wave your arm when the time comes, but there are lots of different neural arrangements that could do that. An analogy that many philosophers invoked at this point was the computer analogy. So it's quite familiar that you could have two different computers and they're both running Microsoft Word and they both say displaying the words are mental events, just arrangements of neurons, but they might be very different machines. One might be a Mac and one might be a PC. What's going on physically inside the machines at the level of basic electronic description might be very different in the two cases. So this led to a position in the philosophy of mind that was known as functionalism. So functionalism is the view, put crudely, that the mind stands to the brain as software stands to hardware. And you can have the same mental property present in two systems, two people, even though the hardware is very different, provided what the hardware does is pretty much the same in its gross effects in both cases. That's a position called functionalism. Okay, but now the old worry about how does the mind affect the body threatens to come back. Because there's this thought, look, surely when your arm moves, it's the arrangement of neurons you've got in your head that's going to move your arm. But if you're a functionalist, you're terribly insistent that your mental state can't be identified with any arrangement of neurons. After all, you share the mental state with all kinds of people who we've agreed have different hardware. But it's the hardware, surely, that's causing your body to move. So it's not the mental state that's causing your body to move. After all, the mental state is a kind of a dangler, a level of description that's not really locking on to the causes of your behavior. And that gives rise to epiphobia. Epiphobia is a condition suffered by functionalists who fear they're turning into epiphenomenalists. Oh dear, our position has driven us back to where we didn't want to be, that the mind's a separate autonomous realm, which therefore has no causal effect because it's autonomous from the level of precise physical description that accounts for our bodily behavior. And I'm just going to tell you this, I'm not going to describe it to you, there's a lot of philosophical literature, a lot, like, I'm guessing 10,000 articles, 20, I don't know what's the kind of orders of magnitude of, but a good percentage, 20% of writing in the English-speaking philosophical world in the last 30 years has been about how to resolve this problem. And there are various not very satisfactory responses in the literature. I'm going to offer a different one, which is a new minority one. It's not peculiar to me, but it's a much nicer one, I think. You might think that this problem is all a problem generated by materialism, and perhaps we should be going back to interactionist dualism. And it's rather striking, if you weren't persuaded by the kind of historically based argument for materialism I gave you, it's rather striking that very few English-speaking philosophers explore this option. The idea that what's going on in our brains are the same kinds of processes of what's going on outside our bodies kind of runs very deep in contemporary informed opinion, and there's scarcely any philosophers I can think of who start querying this in order to account for the power of the mind to affect the body. But I should mention that one very interesting suggestion along these lines has been made by Jonathan Lowe, who many of you will have known and very sadly died in the last year or so. But he has an idea that's worth exploring. He's got a rather nice idea. The idea is that, well, look, if we just look at things at the neuronal level, well, you will always find kind of, for any neural event, neuronal antecedents that are sufficient for it by law. And so we won't, observing what goes on in the brain, get any kind of immediate reason to suppose that there's any extra forces beyond physical ones. But he says that's consistent with the fact that maybe there's some neuronal complexes that produce a separate mental event. He's thinking in dualist terms now. And that mental event then is the cause of the subsequent behavior. But it's not going to be immediately obvious because the things that produce the mental event will also be there before the behavior, so how do you know that they're not the cause? And he says, well, but maybe they're not, though. Maybe if you had a world in which you had just those neural events and they didn't produce the mental stuff, then it wouldn't be the case that you got the later one. It's the causal chain goes up through the mental events in a somewhat undetectable way. I mean, his view does have not practically testable, but as it were, in principle testable consequences. So he doesn't think there's any general physical laws that say whenever you get those neural arrangements you'll get this further result. He thinks there's no composition laws, it's just a brutally, specifically mental phenomenon that when you get those arrangements you get this extra thing that produces the result. And in fact, an ex-student of mine and friend of Jonathan's who's speaking at our Emergence workshop in the Philosophy of Mind next Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday is very interested in Jonathan's suggestion and is currently exploring it. David Yates. So if you come next Wednesday, I think, David Yates will be talking about this. Let me give you an indication of how I think we ought to solve this problem. How to cure our epiphobia. How to understand how the mental realm has effects in the physical world. It's not just epiphenomenal, even though it can't be equated with specific neural arrangements. And I think the way to deal with this is to re-examine the notion of causation. So, I think philosophers aren't very good at thinking about causation. They tend to have, as do many people, a model of causation as involving basic pushes and pulls. The paradigm of causation, a billiard ball comes along, hits another one, and the second one moves off. And this goes to the idea that if you want to, in some physical setup, physical process, identify the level where the real causal operations are to be found, you have to go down to the most specific physical level, to the kind of level of descriptions in terms of precise particles and their movements and how they bump into each other, or if you're doing it in terms of fields, how the fields are arranged, how they're going to evolve, and so on. Now, I think this is just a mistake. I think this is an intuitive way of thinking about causation, but I think it's wrong. I don't think that's what the nature of causation is. And here's a basic reason for worrying about this intuitive picture of what causation is. And the reason is that causation is not symmetric in time. Sorry, that's a mistake. Basic physics is symmetric in time where causation is not. Causation is asymmetric in time, basic physics is symmetric in time. So when I say basic physics is symmetric in time, I mean that if you've got some basic physical process at the level of precise specifications of all the particles and the field strengths and so on, and you took a movie of that process and then you ran it backwards, you wouldn't be able to tell that the movie run backwards isn't in accord with the basic laws of physics. If run forwards it's in accord with basic laws of physics, run backwards it's in accord with the basic laws of physics as well. Basic laws of physics don't prefer any direction in time. Put it again, if I give you a specification of some physical system of how things are at each point in time, and don't tell you which way time is going, you won't be able to read it off from the basic physical description. Causation is quite different. If I tell you which are the causes and which are the effects, you can read the time off straight away, because causes always come before their effects. And I think this is something this isn't just to do with language, this is to do with the nature of causation. causation has a certain structure in time which is different from the structure of basic physical interaction. There's a nice analogy here with thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics, the increase of entropy. You might think that the increase of entropy was something that can be explained just in terms of basic physics, but it can't be. It can't be because basic physics is time symmetric and entropy increases, and entropy always increases in the forward direction of time. It's later, the later state of the later entropy of any physical system, any closed physical system, will always be higher than the earlier entropy. When you want to explain why entropy always increases, you have to add something to basic physics. What you need to add is a couple of things. You need to... Let me work with an example. Suppose I say I've got some gas and the temperatures of the gas is hot at this end and cold at that end. Maybe I've got a barrier in the gas, right? Now I lift the barrier up, and after a while the temperature will be uniform. Now that's a temporally asymmetric process. The uniformity is always greater later than earlier. You don't get gases that are uniform later on turning up to be cold at one end, hot at the other. In order to explain that, you need something more than just the physics of particle interactions. Physics of particle interactions is perfectly consistent with that thing not happening. You might start off with gas hot at one end, and the precise particles realizing that might be such that later on it didn't get mixed up. Very unlikely, but perfectly possible. So what you have to add is this, that in general, when you have systems like that, of all the ways that you could have precise particles, hot here, cold here, the ones that will lead to not getting mixed up, to keeping the difference, are very, very unlikely. So what you have to add to basic physics are probabilistic assumptions about the kinds of ways in which your macroscopic state can be realized at the microscopic level. If you go down to basic physics, you lose sight of the structure on which the increase of entropy depends. If you go to, so I could explain for my gas exactly why it got mixed up by looking at precise particle movements and showing, well, given those precise particle movements, then it will get mixed up. But that's not really giving me a hold on the general principle that in general systems like that get mixed up. After all, I could have done exactly the same thing for the few rogue systems where you aren't going to get mixing up. In order to get a hold of the general principle that you're going to get mixing up in systems like that, you've got to throw away, so to speak, the specific information that you have about, or you might or might not have about the particles in that specific case, and note that in general, systems with this macroscopic property, temperature high here, low there, are overwhelmingly likely to be realized at the microscopic level by a system that will give you mixed up. But you've thrown away, in giving that explanation, any information about what's going on in your particular system at the microscopic level. That's kind of, I mean, it's there, it's there, and it is going to fix what happens next. But it's not information that's relevant to the general pattern that systems like that get mixed up. And I think the same about causation. I think if you go down to the basic level, you're going to throw away the information that causal structure depends on. Now, maybe you can ask some questions about that later. I can't now fill in details about why I think that causation is like thermodynamics. But I think it's just the same. You need to think of causal systems as having macroscopic states in the sense of states that can be variably realized at the microscopic level. And what makes certain states causes and effects is to do with probability distributions over the way they can be realized at the microscopic level. If you go right down to the macroscopic level, you lose the causal structure, just like you lose the thermodynamic structure. You have to be up at a level that can be variably realized to get things that can be causes. So that's a kind of emergent causation. We've got, think of the thermodynamic analogy. We've got systems that are material through and through. There isn't anything there apart from the particles moving around. But to get the thermodynamic structure or the causal structure, we have to go up to a level of description that throws away some detail. And it's at that level that we have causal facts or thermodynamic facts. So I think this now opens the way for us to say, look, here are mental properties, and they can't be identified with strictly neural properties, but that doesn't eliminate them from the kinds of things that can be causes, because that's the right level to get causation and this isn't. The idea that the neural arrangements are always going to do the causing and therefore kind of excluding the mental events from being causes has got things the wrong way around. It's the mental events, the macroscopic mental events are the causes and the neural events aren't. I want to say that when I waved for the taxi, it was because of this general property, generic property shared with many other people of wanting to get the taxi, and not because of specific neural arrangements that realized it. So this idea is familiar to philosophers from some work about 30 years ago by Stephen Yablo, but it wasn't really taken on by philosophers because they were thinking in terms of this push-pull model of causation. Here's Stephen Yablow's lovely example. So I've got a cape and I wave it at this bull. This bull gets really angry, right? So the cape is red and the cape is crimson. So, right, so the crimson think that's more specific. It's like the neural arrangements, and the redness is like the mental event. And you might think, look, if the bull's got angry, it's because the crimson cape made it angry. That's the very specific thing it's got in front of it. It's got a cape in front of it that's just crimson, right? So that's what made the bull angry. But Yablo said, no, that doesn't have to be the case at all. I mean, you could have, I don't know how it is with bulls. I mean, you could have a bull, you could do it with pinches and training pinches to respond to colours, but I mean, we'll do it with bull. It could be the case that the bull is caused to be angry by the crimsonness, and that would show up if you gave it a scarlet cape or magenta cape. It wouldn't. We've got some lots of nice shades of red around here. It wouldn't do the job. But on the other hand, it might well be the redness per se that makes the bull angry, and that would show up by the fact that any of these shades of red would do the job equally well. And if that's the case, if the bull's made angry by scarlet and magenta and crimson, then the right answer is it's the redness that causes the bull to be angry. And in this particular case, when we've just got a crimson cape here, it's the redness of the cape and not the crimsonness that causes it to be angry. Now, a lot of philosophers said, yes, I can see that, but you're just talking about which aspect of the situation we find interesting or noteworthy or something like that, but surely the causal oomph itself must be at the most basic level. Must be the crimsonness that we've got here that's doing the causing. I say not. I think if you think about the analogy with thermodynamics and the idea that causation is essentially macroscopic, there's no need to privilege the lower levels in this causal competition at all. It might be the higher level that does does the causal work. So, there'll be cases and cases. There are going to be some effects which are due to my specific neuronal arrangements. Suppose, I wave for a taxi in a funny way. You wave for a taxi in a different way. Why is that? Well, I'm wired up differently from you. So if you want to explain why I move my arm like that, then you might refer to specific neuronal arrangements and not just the fact that I want a taxi. But that doesn't mean that my waving as such isn't a perfectly good effect and something that itself needs a cause. And the right cause for that is the property I share with the rest of you, even though I don't share neural arrangements, the property of wanting to stop a taxi. So, thinking about cases like that, comparing them with the bull case, thinking about the analogy of thermodynamics, I think we can conclude that this idea that the mental causes are excluded, outcompeted by their neural realizers is a mistake. In many cases, the mental states will be causes in their own right, independently of the neural realizers. So that's my conclusion. Once you realize that causation is an emergent phenomenon relative to basic physics, then we can understand how there can be autonomous mental causation in the material world. So, I'll stop there.